Good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you may be. Welcome to a short and sharp webinar this day with myself, Jane Miles, and my dear colleague, Sean Lynch. We'll introduce ourselves in a moment. The topic of today's webinar is one that affects all of us, no matter which organization we are in as part of the drug development ecosystem, and that's really how do you find the right people and how do you know you are building an efficient team when you're optimizing your study teams. We're going to talk about it through the lens of decentralized trials. And I think that some of the lessons that my colleague Sean will share are probably applicable across many different parts of team building in drug development. So I guess it's time for introductions. I'm Jane Miles. I'm the VP of Clinical Trial Innovation at Curebase. I also spend a lot of time working with the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, and I've been working in drug development for far too long to talk about, but I have had the privilege of working on, it turns out, many compounds that were approved. Sean inspired me to count recently. I got to 15 and stopped thinking, oh my gosh, I had no idea. So how lucky was I to be on super efficient teams working on super important goals to change how medicine was being practiced. Sean, how about yourself?
I don't have those kind of Hall of Fame numbers, Jane, but I have had the luck of being on and getting to lead a lot of very efficient teams. Starting as a data manager, but then moving into project management, clinical operations. I always told my teams, the drug may not be successful, but it doesn't mean you didn't run a successful project. You were doing good science, and that's ultimately the business that we're in.
Important.
VP of ClinOps here at Curebase, and I lead our clinical operations teams, which is a combination of project managers, clinical research coordinators, data managers, TMF, regulatory specialists, and of course our technology focused team members, implementation specialists. And I love what we do, and it's a pleasure to chat to Jane about my favorite thing, which is building teams.
I think you just framed it really nicely, Sean. When we are working in clinical trials, we are all acting as scientists in one way or another. And I think that's a theme we're going to talk about today as we talk about how do you find the right people and how do you make sure they fit in so they can do what they want to do best. But first, let's set some context and just talk for a minute about the different roles that are needed in a study team. So we really just put up a very basic slide here that shows some of the different roles that show up in that scientific experiment of a clinical trial. And I'm going to ask Sean, which ones do you think are typically associated with a sponsor? Which ones might we play? And we won't even talk about DCTs right now. This is just generally.
Yep. Yeah, we can spend a little talking about this, but it's a great question. There's a lot of different ways to slice and dice a team and divide it between sponsor, CRO, or even vendors. But typically, you're going to have a pair of project managers. Titles aside, we're just going to focus on roles here. There's going to be a project manager on the CRO side, and they're going to have a counterpart on the sponsor side as well. Also on the CRO side, you're going to generally see the data management team, the monitors, site managers. Quite often, those are usually CRO type roles, whereas the sponsor tends to take more of a lead on the medical side of things, the regulatory side of things, and the statistical side of things. In my experience, like there's lots of different ways to do it, but on average, that's generally how I see it. So it's the division between, higher level tasks that have direct interactions from a medical or regulatory point of view with the people who are generally working with the sites, the vendors, and the patients. It's a very simple mental model that I have, Jane. But what's been your experience?
Golly, all over, actually, very much dependent on the sort of organization I was working with at the time or working in. So in big traditional pharma, maybe all of these roles came from within in a tiny startup, which I moved to later, maybe we actually relied on an external firm to provide both medical advisor and a statistician. So I think the takeaway here is you can build the team with any experts that fit the question you're trying to answer, but you all need to make sure you're playing on the same team, regardless of where your origin, where your title is associated. That's my experience. How about you, Sean?
Very much so. I would say I'm a classically trained project manager with all the titles and PMPs behind it. And to me, the PM, no matter how you set up the rest of the team, that project manager really is the heart and soul of a unified team, no matter where the people are actually sitting. And all of that starts with just defining what each person is going to do. You know, whether you do it in a formalized racy type grid or some simple swim lanes, teams are most effective when everyone understands exactly what is expected of them. And when you set a very clear success criteria and show them what great looks like, people will always go above and beyond and surprise you by overachieving at that point. Most project teams fail because they don't get those fundamentals right. And so, you know, what we're going to talk about a lot today is like, how can you establish a team full of people who understand what they're doing, especially in, you know, a unique and interesting field like decentralized clinical trials.
Okay, let's dive one layer deeper into the DCT world. You can see a lot of these boxes are still blue, but there are some new players in the diagram. And we wanted to call that out because while you're still going to have that first slide team, in a DCT, you're probably going to have some new roles or some new circles on the diagram that weren't in the last diagram. So Sean, you want to walk us through? I see the project manager is still at the heart here.
Yes, they most certainly are, but it's actually taking it even a step further and not just being a more traditional project manager that uses the waterfall methodology that you often see. And by that, I mean, you must finish task A to move on to task B. It's very much stop start and doesn't allow for any flexibility. Something goes wrong, you kind of have to go all the way back to the start and figure it out. Whereas, you know, great DCT teams use agile project methodology, which means iteration, it means flexibility, it means working in smaller focused sprints is the terminology that we use. And this is extremely common in more tech startups than in a traditional clinical ops team. But I'm actually starting to see it really be embraced by both all the players in the DCT world, as well as some of our big pharma sponsors. It really is exciting for me. I'll geek out on it a little bit, but I love agile project management and clinical trials. Working our way around the clock here then, just to describe some of these different roles. Yes, you know, there's a clinical project manager, but they do need support. One of the biggest pain points, and perhaps we'll dive into this a little bit more, is oftentimes many people don't still understand exactly what a DCT is, Jane. I know you have experienced this quite a lot in your work with the DTRA, but the director project manager needs to be that thought leader. They are the ones who actually need to help guide the sponsor along this journey to help them understand what they need to do. It's change management, and that's a really important part of the role too. Clinical research coordinators, you don't usually see those on a CRO team because they're typically at the site level, where they form what I think is the most interesting part of any clinical trial team. It's that unique golden triangle of PI, patient, and CRC. The webinar for a different day, Jane. I could talk all day about that. But when you are staffing virtual or remote sites, you do need remote CRCs to actually interact with the patients via telemedicine. This is complementary to the CRCs that will exist at a physical site as well. Now, there are sites, whether they're virtual or physical. And so just evolving the more traditional role of a trial manager or site manager to a site concierge. Again, there's so much we are all learning about DCT. This is someone who's building relationships, who's learning what the pain points are at the site level, at the patient level, and building solutions that is going to help everyone figure out how can we best implement a DCT in this particular protocol. Moving into a bit more of the technology stuff, clinical implementation specialists. So there is a technology component to DCT. We all know that. And we also know it's a bit of a pain point at times because there's lots of different competing technologies and maybe they're not all working closely together. So by focusing on workflows, by focusing on patient and site experience, can we build a world class? I always think of the example of, what are other great consumer experiences that you've had outside of clinical research? Apple is an obvious one. Can we build a consumer experience that matches those standards? And that's what the clinical implementation specialist is focused on. I'm going to skip a level and come back to study engineer in just a moment. But instead of clinical data managers, we need clinical data scientists taking that data to the next level. A lot of the information we're collecting in DCT is of a greater volume and variety than more traditional clinical trials. And so this is an evolution of the data management role into someone who can actually consume and organize and analyze that very interesting data layer. And then a role that you'll never see in a more traditional clinical trial, the study engineer. And so this is someone who has joined a company like Curebase because of their passion for the mission. They definitely have a more technology focused background. They are programmers and coders and product managers, and they're truly excited to bring their unique skill set to solve the problem of clinical research. And why do we need them on a ClinOps team? It's because the answer is not figured out yet. There's always some customization, and we must be agile and flexible in the solutions that we're delivering, whether it's a technology or process-based innovation. So let's embed our tech colleagues directly in the team and therefore give them a better understanding of the problem they're trying to solve. So that's a quick overview, Jane. I'm sure there's lots we can talk about each bucket here.
No, I think it's really helpful. The data scientist, what I heard was, might be looking at data at a different level, where in traditional trials, data managers looked at what data has been collected and what status is it in? Is it clean? Is it locked? The data scientist may go further than that and look for insights within the data that's being collected to help drive different iterations of the actual study process and workflows. Is that a fair way to say that?
That is absolutely 100% correct. And I can use a kind of simple example, I think, to explore that a bit more. Vital signs, right? We're all so used to vital signs being collected at specific visits as per the protocol. And you collect that temperature at a couple of time points. That's what we call a discrete variable, right? You're collecting it once a week for a couple of months. Easy to analyze, easy to collect. But what if you're wearing a fancy, digital device that collects your temperature continuously? That is a lot more data. And how do you analyze that data if you're collecting that data point 1,000 times a day? Your data set has grown to a volume, a size that is really difficult to understand. And of course, there's natural fluctuations along the way as well. Do you analyze every single data point? Do you analyze the average or the median? There's so many ways to do this that you need very well-defined processes and protocols to shift your mindset from a discrete analysis to continuous data analysis. And this requires working with statisticians, requires working with the medical team who've written the protocol and even the regulators so that they understand that, is this an endpoint that you're collecting? How can I set up my study in the first place so that I'm collecting the data that I need? So it's a completely different mindset than simply being a team that builds databases and cleans the data that's put into it. It's truly becoming the stewards and owners of the clinical data. Massive evolution. And there's some really exciting work being done in this space. I will not claim ownership of this idea, but there's a lot of great thought leaders in this space.
I'm going to just make two referential comments for those people who are curious about this. One is a paper released by Tufts, I think it was December 2020, where they actually predicted the future of clinical operations staffing needs. And these data scientists, not just in data management roles, but across the whole organization of ClinOps, came up as a theme. Might be in study planning as well as study execution. So go check that out. We can drop it into the information when we post the webinar. And the second is the FDA's guidance on digital health technology and collecting data for registrational use using digital devices. That was published late last year, and it has been very helpful, Sean, to answer questions like you just raised. Is this data that I'm collecting going to be used as an endpoint? And if so, what do I need to do to ensure it will meet all of the regulatory standards? That's another webinar. We'll talk about that another day.
Would love to.
So as you're staffing, I'm going to skip around a little bit, but how exactly do you find these people successfully? And what are the strategies you use to actually staff an efficient DCT team?
You're asking all the tough questions on a Monday morning, Jane.
Yes.
I would say finding and onboarding brilliant talent for a DCT team is actually the number one challenge that we all have. Yes, look, there are technology pain points, and yes, there are process and even regulatory pain points, but finding the right material to work with in the first place is a big challenge, because no matter how brilliant our technology gets, or even if the regulators get on board, clinical trials require people. They always will. People are at the heart of everything we do. So who do we look for? Clearly there's kind of a threshold. Like there's this GCP regulatory clinical trial experience that everyone must have. I always keep my book of regulations right next to me at all times, because this is a very serious business that we work in. And so everyone who works in a DCT ClinOps team must have that internalized. They must deeply understand the regulations and be able to just translate it into the actions that they do. But beyond that, I'm looking for people who think differently, and that's really hard to hire for. Especially in a project manager. Project managers, the good ones, are very polished communicators because they're used to fielding challenging questions and turning it around and figuring out solutions. But what I'm really testing for when I'm interviewing and looking for talent is someone who can think differently. I'll give you a simple example. One of the rules on my team is we never want to hear the words, "That's how it's always been done," because that assumes that the answer is static. Whereas in decentralized clinical trials, there's a lot of things we haven't quite figured out yet. And so we need to be able to understand, how do we solve problems as a team? How can we ask the right questions to pull answers out of everyone? How can we guide people to better solutions that are actually going to solve the unique challenges that trying to do remote and decentralized trials have? And so we do a lot of, instead of just questions, one-on-one questions-based interviews, we do a ton of collaborative panel interviews, a little bit different from the case studies you might often see elsewhere. We just want people to start a blank document, and we'll start asking them interesting scenarios and questions. And rather than have them give the answer, we want them to work with the panel of interviewers to pull the answer out of us. It's a very interesting shift in how you interview people, but a great partner, a great person that you want to work with, should be able to work with the 3 or 4 other people on the Zoom call and help us all craft a solution together. So that's just one technique that we use. When I was interviewed here at Curebase several months ago, it just blew my mind, just the difference in collaboration and how you can get insights into how successful people are. Jane, you're on mute.
You're right. Thanks. How do you set someone up to be successful in the interview? I don't mean to get hired, but even to set the expectations, this is going to be a little different than what you've been through before.
Just transparency. We set the expectations really early, just like you should do in any project. You make it really clear to people, this is going to be different. You are going to be challenged. You might feel discomfort, and you will feel out of your comfort zone, and that's totally fine, because after all, we're really forging a new path here in DCT, and you're going to be out of your comfort zone quite often, and that's okay. We want to get people comfortable with discomfort, and by setting that expectation early, it's really interesting, Jane. We all maybe have some bias that this person's been in the company for so long, That's a big CRO, big pharma. There's no way they can ever adapt to, DCT. We have to put that bias aside because most people have never had the opportunity to do this because they've been in a system or framework that doesn't allow them the chance to think independently and come up with new solutions. And when you take off the shackles, people will surprise you because they know where the pain points are and they're desperate to fix them. So those are the type of people that are really successful in DCT when they felt the pain and they're really, really passionate about fixing the problem. And you give them the opportunity to do so, they will constantly amaze you.
So what I heard here were a couple things. One, thinking of chemical reactions. Substrate is what goes into a chemical reaction. There are some ingredients you need, and the hardest substrate that you are looking for right now is the staff, the resourcing substrate. But that ingredient list includes people who have enough pain or passion and some table stakes elements like understanding GCP and the will to make it better.
Yes. You said it so much more elegant than me.
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think about this a lot, right? Like, how do you help someone who's going to try something new understand what will happen and find their voice so that they can really be a change maker in the process?
Yes. We are all change makers. Every person on the team that we showed in the previous slide has the ability to impact how that trial is going to be executed. And so there's lots of simple tricks that we teach the team to try and help them be successful day to day in the tactical problem solving that they're having. One of these is strong convictions, loosely held, right? You must know, like you said, the fundamentals of clinical research. And there are some lines that cannot even be approached, never mind crossed, of course. But you should also be willing to explore, are there alternatives to those truisms that we've all been taught in our careers? And at least be willing to ask the question. So strong convictions loosely held. Go in with an idea, but be willing to be convinced by your partners when they use data, when they act like a scientist. And when you do that, again, amazing, innovative solutions will always come out of that.
So let's talk a little bit about one of the ingredients that you've referenced, and that is we're all learning in this together, and you can do your best to define what you think will happen with workflows, with that collaboration. And sometimes it's just going to get messy. So how do you staff for what I call tolerance for ambiguity and the willingness to drive clarity when it's really murky?
Yep, it's a good question again. I think I've drawn a lot from the startups that I've worked with in the last couple of years and really deeply listening to my tech colleagues, right? Often there's like this tech ops divide and people might think there's a tension between us, but there's so much we can learn from people who have a more traditional tech background. And that's because they truly are engineers and they are scientists in many ways as well. And they're willing, like any scientist, to experiment. And what's the most important part of an experiment? It's writing down your hypothesis, figuring things out with data, exploring your results, and then learning and iterating again and again and again. And that's one of the most important things you can do when you're learning decentralized clinical trials is acknowledge up front, I'm not going to get this 100% right the first time. No one's that good. No one's that lucky. But you must go with the mindset that I'm going to figure out what went well, what didn't go well, and I'm going to write down exactly what happened, whether you call it lessons learned or postmortems or retros. Write it down, fix every problem that you can, and do it again, and acknowledge you're gonna fail again. So this is where I'll throw in an Irish poet quotation here, Samuel Beckett, as he said, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. I always think about that whenever I'm starting a new process.
An Irish poet quote later, but Okay, so you've hired people who are good at this iteration process and understanding it's not always going to be clear. We're going to take data, solve problems, do better. How do you bring along a traditional clinical trials team at the sponsor level who may not be cut from that same cloth? So you end up with a cohesive team trying to solve for the same goal.
Oh, so many tough questions on a Monday morning. Um, I I would be lying if I said I'd fully figured it out, because the first few times I've tried this, I think I failed. But, you know, learning from those mistakes is what's really important. And the first is like assuming that they're on the same page with you, because they're probably not. And I think this is part of the evolution of DCT, is like it's still being figured out. A lot of people have different definitions than this. You and I have talked about that. I think I'm on the same page as you now, but we're all coming from different places. And a really good team member has empathy for that. They understand, okay, this person may not be on the same page as me for what this process means. Why don't we sit down and have a real conversation about it? Why don't we explore that and educate before we even start the process? So here at Curebase, we call that a pre-mortem. We actually sit down before we even start the process and we figure out what could go wrong, what will go wrong. And by asking those what if questions, you actually help both sides really come to a good place of understanding what the process is about. Especially in bigger organizations, change management is tough. They have entire departments that are responsible for change management, and change is really difficult the bigger the organization. So again, having empathy and understanding for that, we must give our partners the tools and resources they need so that they can make the change as well. And also assuming good intent, right? They're here, whether they're whatever they call their department, innovation or center of excellence, they want change too. They genuinely do want to change how clinical research is doing. So if you give them what they need and you get in the journey alongside with them, it can really make a huge difference when you just change your mindset to being literally in the same boat as them, pointing in the same direction.
Yeah, I think a lesson learned I have acquired over the past year, especially with DTRA, to your point, Sean, is helping your project team understand there are some parts of this process that are going to be exactly the same. That's the scientific rigor, that's the data quality and PI oversight. And there are some parts where we have freedom to operate. And helping your sponsor team work with your DCT team to figure out where are we holding firm and where are we playing to iterate is really the art of finding your way through the DCT process. That's my aha for the year.
Yes, there is a middle road there, and I think we're better defining what those boundaries are, and like just really excited for what's going to happen as we educate and bring more people into DCT. There's going to be some really fantastic thought leaders that will just suddenly land in this area, and they're going to have amazing ideas. It just takes some time for more people to get exposed to DCT. But once they do, they'll recognize that this should have been the way it was all along. It's just taken us some time to get here.
Probably the best question I heard all year was, when is the D going to be dropped from DCT? We'll park that for another day. So if you're hiring someone into this environment, what are the things you tell them to expect? What might be different when they join an organization like Curebase?
So I think there's two answers I'll give there. First is speed, the speed at which things happen. We'll explore that in just a minute. And the second thing is the independence, which is really interesting as well. But let's start with speed. Things do move faster because a lot of the organizations working in DCT are smaller, they're startups, and they've startup speed culture. But speed isn't always the right way to do it. A phrase I've coined recently within my own team is we actually sometimes need patience. We need to have patience for our patients. it's important to move fast, but it's more important to do the right thing. And so I think sometimes the speed of decision making is something that people really need to adjust to. And something you said earlier, we must still hold the true rigors of clinical research near and dear to our hearts and make sure that we're doing the right thing at all times. So again, it's about finding that right balance between moving quickly to do the right thing for our patients and our sites, and just getting that done.
Yeah.
And then
I
the
call
other thing
that
is
slowing down to speed up, actually.
slowing down to speed up. Yep, exactly. And the second big thing that people need to adjust to is actually being a little bit more independent. Perhaps people are coming from larger organizations where there's a very strict hierarchical structure and there's SOPs for everything and systems for everything. And people need to adjust to a little bit more ambiguity and independence. And this is a really good thing. And I'm a big movie buff, so I'm going to throw in a Matrix quote now, but you must free your mind. And once you can do that, the possibilities are really endless. You start realizing there's a lot of inefficiencies in what we've all been taught as classical clinical research. And by simply challenging the norms, you can find those 1% changes. And those 1% changes all add up. I'm full of things that full of random quotes, Jane. But one thing I always say to my teams is there is no magic bullet in clinical research. It just doesn't exist. If it existed, I think we'd have found it by now because of all the smart people who've worked in this industry for 70 years. But instead, there's all these incremental changes that when you add them up, that is the secret to cracking the code for clinical research. And that takes a special person. Like you have to tell people it's okay. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. It's okay to feel challenged, because it's only when you're challenged that's when you grow.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. The magic bullet is something that we may not need to find in order to drive the changes we're seeking. That's what I hear from you. Incremental change and innovation done repeatedly and iteratively can be enough to move the needle, but you've got to find someone who's willing to keep pushing on where the innovation can happen. Is that fair?
That's right. That is totally fair. That's totally fair. We're not going to leap from here to here overnight, but we can get there if we just put in the hard work and ask the right questions and make sure we're not stagnating along the way.
But I also heard something really important that is not always how I experienced clinical operations teams, even with great intention. Sometimes in those teams, it felt like you really couldn't be wrong, or you would never get over it within that team. And what I'm hearing from you is we all expect to be wrong, but we all imagine that we can find a different approach together.
Yes. And that is why, you and I are big football fans, Jane. We were just chatting about it earlier. A great team, when one person makes a mistake, they pick them back up off the ground, right? And so that can happen in clinical research too. Maybe someone makes a mistake, but a really great team, that like village of people around them, they make sure that person never falls too far, that there's a safety net built around them. And I think that's what the regulations are for. There's a safety net built around everything that we do. And when you set up a really strong DCT team, it allows people to experiment, to innovate, but there are checks and balances in place to make sure that you never fail big. You fail small, you learn, you get up and you keep going again. And when a team knows that, when they actually have that sense of security and safety, and the project manager has communicated this to them clearly, that I want you to come up with 10 ideas and 7 of them are going to be terrible, but 3 of them are going to be great. That's when amazing ideas come out of a team, when they have that freedom of expression. Also really hard to hire for, but like you find people who are willing to do that way and you just embed them into your culture. You teach them, you coach them, you mentor them, and you allow them to do that, and it yields excellent rewards, both personally and for the trial as well, of course.
So I'll say it another way. If the science of the experiment leads to a negative outcome of the trial, that's okay. Either
Yeah,
there was safety or an efficacy issue. Those are the parameters of the scientific experiment that we hold true. What
that's
you
right.
don't want is the science to go wrong because of an operational or technical failure.
Correct. Correct.
And figuring out how you get all of your team members trained and ready to go in pursuit of that scientific goal is your mission every day.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But I love what I do. And I like to surround myself with people who are equally as passionate. Um, and that's another thing that part is actually easy to interview for. It's easy to pick up when people truly want to make a difference. And those are the folks that I think are being naturally pulled into the DCT realm. Because at the end of the day, there's lots of ways of saying this, but patients are waiting for us. And this is a unique opportunity we all have to make a huge difference. And if that doesn't get you up in the morning and wanting to succeed, I don't know what will.
So I'm going to end our call this morning, our webinar, with my own Irish poet quote.
Ooh, good.
And it's on my mind a lot these days if you're following me on LinkedIn. But my quote is actually pertinent, I think, to innovation as a whole and DCT specifically. And it's from Bono. And this phrase goes around in my brain every day. And that is, if you want to kiss the sky, better learn how to kneel. And as we're taking on new methods in science, we all kneel a bit so we can learn something new. But to your point, it doesn't mean you're going to stay down. You will kiss the sky.
Well, there's no segue from that. That was amazing. I love a good YouTube quote.
I recommend his autobiography, but you got to listen to it. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I don't see any questions in the chat. We hope that this was interesting and maybe useful, but if you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to Sean or me directly on LinkedIn or with the information that'll be populated with the webinar. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone.